and different plant lists that might be available, and then recommend you to a couple of local resources of where you can buy the plants or interface with local landscape design studios, all of which have great reputations in dealing with these issues of environmental restoration and kind of native plant design. So this is from my house, and I think it, for me, like it's a simple slide. It's got the rainbow. It's just, quintessential, like this is our beautiful lake, right? But the history of vegetation at the lake has been pretty interesting, and eventually I think we're going to look to kind of flush that out in greater detail. But primarily when I walk around the historic native landscape of Fonsdock and this particular little climate, there's a lot of beech, there's a lot of sweet birch, tulip trees, sassafras, your oaks and your maples, hop hornbeam. There's just a kind of beautiful kind of palette that's very specific, actually, not just kind of native to New York State, but really native to this little ecotone that we are all living in. I think probably has been best studied through Fonsdock and its kind of native plant list that is developed in the kind of index of plants that have happened over time. So we can use those as a kind of basis of design to then implement into our own properties. In the 70s, so that was what the lake was, I think, when people came here, right? In the 50s, they were looking for woods, they were looking for this other kind of condition, different than the city, different from the manicured garden. In the 70s and 80s, on my property, and I'm sure on a lot of yours, you started to get this influx of exotic species, right? And it was about gardening, it was about beautifying. So you get, your big rhododendrons and your barberries and azaleas, and you get your pretty flowering, cherries and other trees and things that really came mostly from Asia, but really from all over, that were like garden plants, right? This whole kind of different thing. Then the 90s and early 2000s has been this kind of great native plant movement, right? We kind of return to like what's specific to the area and then how can we use that, encourage wildlife, encourage kind of stormwater management. And so we're still on the kind of tail end, I think, of that movement. And we're diving into better understanding that it's not just a broad brush, right? So people say native plants, sometimes that means New York State, or sometimes that means Fonsdock, sometimes that means New York State, sometimes that means the whole Northeast, sometimes that means east of the Mississippi, sometimes that just means America, right? And so it gets really, it's an evolving term. And I think what we can better do now is through landscape performance and metrics and understanding the actual impact of plant by plant, what they can do in certain areas. It's really about site specificity. So I've done a lot of work in the city and kind of vegetative systems in the city and understanding the impact of those. And we're beginning to kind of draw out specific plants that are really appropriate to this place. I'm just going to speak for like 5 minutes. You do not need to write all these down if you're interested in this stuff, but we'll pass this around and we'll be further kind of developing this and sharing this with the intention of creating a couple of planting design palettes that people may be able to implement on their own property. But just taking 4 different conditions, one being the lake and kind of stream edge, and looking at different strata of plants. So your larger trees, these are not like tulip tree, 80 feet, 90 feet tall trees. These are kind of more residential scale native trees, shrubs, and perennials that can all kind of work together as a system. And you can look at, we're not just thinking about the performance values of these, but we're also thinking about the kind of aesthetic qualities of them. And so how you can basically begin to create a palette that's both native, that will help and be appropriate for lake management, but then also will provide beauty and value to your property. And so I think that's, in concert with the kind of lake management specialist, be able to really deliver something that I think is really particular and is not kind of singular. So there's a lot of different options for what this might be, right? So this is just a general starting point. But you can look in terms of your own color preferences, your own kind of look of what you want the place to look like, begin to develop a palette appropriate to your property. So just to run through the list, things like a tupelo trees, Nyssa sylvatica is a great native tree, beautiful form, great fall color. Sassafras, I think you find stands of that growing up many places around the lake. Sourwood would be an excellent choice, Magnolia virginiana. There are specific cultivars now that aren't straight species, but are similar to the native species that actually provide a little bit more hardiness or resiliency. So we've listed out some of those cultivars where appropriate. Other native shrubs like inkberry, clethra, which you find growing natively in the woods here in the road edge, the pussy willow, and then winterberry. You can see, there's a kind of range, and you can provide different seasonal interest at different times to begin to create this kind of fourth seasonal garden. So, and then the perennials, if you've ever walked by, a lot of our streams will have the cardinal flower growing right up out of the water, but that can also be a great kind of street or lake edge plant as long as it stays consistently wet. Similarly, swamp butterfly weed is a great plant that helps kind of encourage the monarch butterfly. And then a number of other plants, the golden alexander, the mountain mint, and then a number of native grasses, and then the horsetail. This I see growing up on Oak Ridge quite a bit. Many of the grasses, there's probably 12 to 15 I'd recommend. We just selected 2 here, but have really deep rooted systems. So that's a great kind of strategy for the stream edge, both from terms of the buffer and limiting the geese kind of coming up onto your property, but also providing this like really simple, low maintenance, you cut them back once a year, but deep rooted system to help limit the amount of kind of surface runoff going into the lake. Upland conditions, I would say this is primarily, there's quite a bit of topography around the lake depending on where you go, but this I would imagine is primarily in open or sunny spots that are primarily around the house. So you think about your kind of larger red oaks, things like quaking aspen, getting some evergreen structure, getting full sun. You could go with something like the red cedar, would really invite a lot of wildlife habitat, and even things that you might find growing typically on the side of a road like staghorn and sumac, that a little bit more edgier in terms of like a residential plant, but it's really beautiful and really resilient. Mm-hmm. And then other shrubs, native shrubs like elderberry, mountain laurel, which you find growing all over Fahnestock, high bush blueberry, and then the common witch hazel, and then a kind of perennial layer of Amsonia, the Botoloa grass, again, a butterfly weed, and then some other kind of accents of color, and most of which are native, some other are just extremely drought tolerant and kind of adapted to these conditions, and again, very low maintenance. We all have, I think, forest edge kind of conditions and shadier moments throughout our properties. And so you can encourage things like yellow birch to kind of take hold, amelanchier, which is a juneberry or serviceberry, the Straya, which is hop hornbeam, musclewood, all great kind of trees for those shadier edges. You can go with the great native rhododendron instead of kind of Asian rhododendron. A lot of it is really just finding these plants. So I'm going to give you some sources of where to get them. If you go to Home Depot, unfortunately, they carry mostly kind of exotic species. Low bush blueberry, and then spice bush, which you see growing all over our native woods here. And then the perennial layer, these are really like the heavy hitters that you see throughout this region. All the sedge grasses, this is Pennsylvania sedge, although there's a number of different ones which could fill this category. Hay-scented fern, a great kind of, both of which would be great replacements for Pachysandra or Vinca that people now probably have on their property. Ephemerals like mayapple, which kind of come up, for a couple of months and then kind of disappear. Again, tiarella is another great ground cover replacement, or the wild geranium. Baneberry, ostrich fern and Solomon seal, more kind of accents throughout the garden. And then lastly, you know, I happen to be, I guess, as a gardener, lucky to live on this side of the lake where we don't have a lot of deer kind of infiltrating, you know, because of I guess, because of the proximity of the Taconic, the kind of tighter narrowness between the lake edge and the Taconic. We don't get a lot of deer coming in. I've seen them occasionally, but rarely, I would say. Right, Kate?
The first time I told somebody, we don't get deer at all, he said, look at your house right there.
Oh yeah, occasionally, yeah.
Yeah, but not much.
Not much. And, but, you know, obviously that's a common problem, right? When you're trying to kind of augment your landscape, especially on, I guess, the eastern edge of the lake. And so these are deer resistant species, so that doesn't mean that they're not gonna eat them. It means that they're kind of lower on the preference list of what they would prefer to eat. But so things like river birch, the native fruiting pawpaw tree is like a fantastic tree. Pitch pine for your sunnier conditions, and then even bottlebrush buckeye, which I just saw over here right next to 234. It's kind of natively growing at the edge. Great kind of shrub to kind of implement, and also deer resistant. Some of your viburnums, bayberry, quinquefoils, and sumacs, all kind of low growing shrubs. And then ground cover layers, things like bearberry, which can be a little fussy, but you'll find growing all over Fondstock. Sweet woodruff, and then a whole bunch of ferns, and then other kind of accent perennials, and then grasses. Little blue stem is kind of one of our greatest native resilient grasses. It takes very little maintenance. So that's really it. And again, like I will circulate these and this whole PDF. Some of these include some of our resources, so just looking at Fondstock's historical data and how we can use that as a starting point to develop our own planting palettes, as well as kind of retail nurseries that are available to buy native plants. Unfortunately, it's not readily available, and often you have to go through a landscape professional to be able to source some of these things, which is really unfortunate. But some of these are nurseries that do carry a whole host of native plants. So it's something that if you were to develop your plant list, maybe based on this PDF or subsequent iterations of it, you could send them a list, kind of see what's available, and then make a trip to kind of purchase those all kind of retail nurseries. And then I'm just going to finish by showing you a couple of local, oops. Yep, let's go to Firefox. Yeah, it's, oh, here we go. Disappeared. Is there another tab open?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Sorry, it's
Okay, laptop. So there's three local landscape firms that I personally know, and I haven't done exhaustive research yet, so don't take this as the kind of only place. But I think part of the problem that AJ referred to is like, hey, we develop these plans, and then sometimes they just kind of stop there, because there's nobody really to kind of carry them forward into implementation. Most wholesalers and landscape professionals will source things from, this is one of the great nurseries, North Creek Nursery, that develops a lot of smaller plug-based material. So it's not like retail ready, like you go to Home Depot and it's a big plant. They can be like this small, right? But it's much more cost effective, and you can buy a lot more material, and you don't get big areas of kind of exposed mulch. You plant things a little bit closer together, and then you give it a season to grow in.
Where are they located?
What's that?
Where are they located? Is that like internet, or is that local?
So unfortunately, North Creek is only a wholesaler. So the other nurseries I listed in the previous slide were retail centers. This is something you'd have to go through a landscape professional to get. But this is a great resource if you ever wanted to look online and kind of see what was available, read about the characteristics of those particular plants, and I'll put this in an email with Ina as well. And then three great firms that I recommend just having either known them from past professional experience or seeing their spaces. One Nature, they're over in Beacon. They actually have a native plant nursery on Main Street, so it's definitely worth popping in. It's not a huge variety or selection, but they do also have another grow center that they grow for state DEC projects. And so Brian Quinn, who's the principal at the firm, is a landscape architect, but kind of great resource. They also do a lot of design build work. So they're somebody that I'm actually going to be using on my own property to kind of implement some plans I've developed over time. So great kind of resource. The other would be Hudson Garden Studio. Hudson Garden Studio, which is located over in Cold Spring. Liz Campbell Kelly she does not do implementation, but she's a designer and she works with a number of local contractors. So again, like if you're interested in these kind of native plant approaches, she would be a great resource. We worked together for a number of years at a previous firm. And she also does a lot of residential scale projects, and so has a lot of experience working specifically in Putnam County. And then lastly, a firm in Westchester, Planted Wild. So here, they're actually a newer company. The woman who runs, I'm forgetting her name, actually has a lot of experience.
Munger.
I'm sorry?
Krista Munger.
Krista?
Krista Munger.
Munger.
She's one of the two.
I know the other.
Yeah.
And so I think what's really interesting about their strategy is they're interested in working with suburban homeowners to convert their lawns to kind of more native plantscapes. And so they will do specific consultations with you at a relatively low cost and help you kind of determine which palette is appropriate for you. You can also shop and buy like kits that you can implement on your own. And so that might be an appropriate way to kind of get started and see, whether this works for you. And so you might choose a specific area in your property and look at like augmenting like one bed, and seeing how that works, and then doing more and more the next year. So I just kind of, there's one more.
Where's Planet Wild located?
Planet Wild is in Westchester. Do you know the?
They're in Croton.
Oh, Croton on Hudson.
But they'll go any place.
Yeah.
They'll travel.
Okay.
Okay, and then this is just like, again, follow the call to action as the end, because we can talk about this